The sky over Pelagos Reach burned the color of infected brass, choked with ash and the residue of orbital bombardment that had begun 3 months prior. The agri-world's vast grain fields, once visible from orbit as golden stripes against verdant continents, had become blackened scars where promethium fires still smoldered in the topsoil. The Imperium had declared the planet a holdfast against the encroaching Hive-Fleet Moloch, transforming what had been a breadbasket world into a fortress of trenches, razor wire, and prefabricated bunkers that stretched across 12,000 square kilometers. Captain Ren Falco of the Pelagos 4th Regiment stood in the command trench overlooking the eastern floodplains, watching the horizon shimmer with heat distortion and the movement of something vast approaching through the smoke. His Auspex had died 6 hours ago, its machine spirits silent despite the Mechanicus tech priests' whispered prayers and ritual oils. The Vox crackled with fragmented reports from forward positions, each transmission shorter than the last, each ending in static or screaming. Whatever was coming had already devoured the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd defensive lines. Falco gripped the rail of the fire step, knuckles white beneath his gloves, and tried not to calculate how many hours remained before the eastern front collapsed entirely. The refugees had begun arriving 2 days prior, flooding westward in columns that stretched beyond sight. Agricultural workers, planetary defense militia, minor administratum clerks, entire families carrying what possessions they could salvage from homesteads that no longer existed. The commissariat had established processing stations to separate the able-bodied from the rest, conscripting farmers into labor battalions and redirecting the elderly and children toward evacuation zones that Falco suspected would never see transport ships. The logistics were impossible. Pelagos Reach held a population of 47 million across its 3 primary continents. Imperial Navy vessels could evacuate perhaps 2 million before the Tyranids reached terminal infestation density. The numbers were ashes in his mouth, a calculus of abandonment that kept him awake through the night watches, staring at tactical displays that showed red tide markers advancing like blood through water. He had stopped reporting civilian casualty estimates to regimental command after Colonel Verse told him to focus on military assets and let the Emperor sort the rest. The attack came with dawn, though dawn itself was invisible beneath the ash clouds. Captain Falco heard it first as a vibration through the earth, a rhythmic thunder that built like approaching cavalry, but with the wrong cadence, too fast and too numerous. Then the screams started from the forward listening posts, brief eruptions of terror cut short by wet, tearing sounds that carried across the floodplains with terrible clarity. He raised his magnicoculars and saw them through gaps in the smoke, a living tide of chitin and fang that moved like water across broken ground. Hormagaunts formed the vanguard, 6-limbed nightmares that bounded forward with insectile grace, their slicing talons carving furrows in the mud. Behind them came warrior forms taller than a Lehman Russ, their carapaces glowing with bioluminescent markings that pulsed in coordination across the swarm. Falco could see termagants scuttling between their larger kin, flesh-borer weapons already spitting living ammunition toward the Imperial lines. The sound of it, the chittering hiss of a billion alien throats, drowned out the Vox entirely. He grabbed the handset anyway and screamed the order to commence firing. The Basilisk artillery platforms opened up first, their Earthshaker cannons hurling shells in high parabolic arcs that impacted among the swarm's leading edge. Explosions blossomed orange and black, throwing chitin fragments and alien biomass skyward in gouts of superheated gore. The Tyranids didn't slow. They flowed around the craters like liquid, reforming their advance without pause or hesitation. Heavy bolter teams along the trench line opened fire next, their weapons chattering in overlapping bursts that sent mass reactive rounds slicing through Hormagon formations. The creatures died in dozens, then hundreds, their bodies torn apart by explosive impacts that left steaming chunks scattered across the killing field. More came, always more. Falco watched a termagant crest a low rise barely 300 meters from the trench line and begin advancing in a skittering mass that seemed to ignore the losses shredding their ranks. A las cannon team to his right fired, the beam punching clean through a Tyranid warrior's thorax and flash cooking its internal organs. The creature stumbled, continued forward another 10 meters, then collapsed, still trying to crawl toward the Imperial position.
Even as its limbs lost coordination, the bombardment intensified. Chimera-mounted autocannons joined the fusillade, their shells stitching lines of detonations across the swarm's flanks. Mortars dropped fragmentation rounds into the densest clusters, each explosion sending razor-edged shrapnel through chitinous armor. Guardsmen along the fire step raised lasguns and began firing on semi-automatic, lasbolts creating a strobing light show that turned the approaching tide into a nightmare of flickering shadows and burning alien flesh. Falco drew his bolt pistol and fired into a hormigont that had somehow survived the crossing and was scrambling up the trench wall, its skull exploding in a spray of ichor that spattered across his greatcoat. The air tasted like copper and burning promethium, thick enough to choke on, hot enough that breathing felt like inhaling embers. He could hear the hydraulic whine of the trench's automated defense turrets swiveling to track new targets, their cogitators selecting priority threats and adjusting firing solutions with mechanical precision.
None of it mattered. The swarm kept coming. Then the sky tore open, not metaphorically, not as poetic exaggeration, but as an observable physical phenomenon that made every soldier in the trench line look up despite the death closing around them. The ash clouds spiraled inward toward a point directly above the battlefield's center, rotating with unnatural symmetry as if drawn by invisible hands. Light blazed through the opening, not the sickly radiance of the warp, but something cleaner, almost blue-white in its intensity. Falco felt pressure against his eardrums, a building tension like the moment before lightning strikes. The air itself seemed to compress, then release in a soundless concussion that rippled across the floodplains, invisible waves. Tyranids stumbled mid-charge, guardsmen fell to their knees, the heavy bolters ceased firing, their gunners staring upward with expressions caught between terror and awe. Through the opening in the clouds, something descended. It fell like a meteor, but slowed like a leaf, defying every principle of mass and velocity that Falco's mind tried to impose. The figure was humanoid, that much was clear, but wreathed in shifting elements that made details difficult to discern. Fire spiraled around one arm in geometric patterns that resembled High Gothic script, but predated any language Falco recognized. Water formed a counter-rotating helix around the other arm, droplets hanging suspended in defiance of gravity. Air currents, visible as heat shimmer, formed a sphere around the torso, expanding and contracting like breath. And beneath the figure's feet, the earth itself rose to meet them, soil and stone flowing upward in a pillar that solidified into a platform of compressed minerals. The descent took perhaps 15 seconds. It felt like watching the birth of a star. When the figure finally touched ground on the raised earthen platform, the elements dispersed in a pulse of force that knocked the nearest Tyranids backward and sent ripples across the mud like dropped stones in water. Silence followed, absolute and unnatural. The Tyranid swarm had stopped advancing, thousands of alien organisms frozen mid-stride, as if every synaptic connection to the hive mind had simultaneously severed. Falco could see their limbs twitching, mandibles working soundlessly, but the coordinated assault had become a tableau of paralyzed biomass. The figure stood motionless on the earthen platform, head turning slowly to survey the battlefield with what seemed like incomprehension. From this distance, Falco could make out more details through his magnoculus. The armor wasn't armor in any imperial sense, more like layered wrappings of cloth and leather worked with symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if the patterns themselves resisted observation. The figure carried no visible weapons, but energy radiated from them in waves that made the air shimmer and twist. Most striking were the markings on the exposed skin of the arms and neck, geometric tattoos that glowed with soft blue light and seemed to pulse in rhythm with the figure's breathing. Captain Falco's first coherent thought was Psyker. His second was Heretic. His third was the Emperor Protects, because what else could you think when confronted with something so far outside doctrinal reality that existing categories failed entirely? He lowered the magnoculus and found his hand moving toward the Vox handset before conscious decision engaged. Protocol demanded he report this to regimental command immediately. Protocol demanded he request Adeptus Arbites containment and possible inquisitorial intervention.
Protocol demanded he treat this as a threat until proven otherwise, because on Imperial worlds, the burden of proof fell entirely on the suspected. But his hand stopped halfway to the Vox unit, arrested by what happened next on the battlefield below. The figure raised both arms, movements flowing with deliberate grace that suggested ritual or kata rather than combat technique. Fire ignited along the right arm, not the wild promethium flames of Imperial weaponry, but controlled ribbons of combustion that spiraled upward in perfect helices. Water materialized around the left arm, pulled from the air itself, or perhaps the moisture in the soil, forming spheres that orbited the elbow and wrist like miniature moons. The earth beneath the platform rippled outward in concentric rings, stone and soil responding to unseen command. And the air, the Emperor helped them all. The air began to move in patterns that created visible pressure differentials, zones where wind currents formed barriers and channels that bent light at their edges. Falco had seen sanctioned psychers bend reality through warp-touched power, watched them scream prayers to the Emperor as their bodies became conduits for powers that burned them from within. This was different. This was controlled, deliberate, almost serene. The Tyranids broke paralysis all at once, their collective pause ending as abruptly as it began. The swarm surged forward with renewed intensity, hormagaunts bounding across the killing field in leaping charges that closed the distance to the earthen platform in seconds. The figure didn't move from position, didn't retreat or brace for impact.
Instead, they brought both hands together in a sharp clap that produced no sound but sent a shockwave radiating outward in a perfect sphere. Fire met water in the space between the figure's palms, the collision generating steam that expanded with explosive force and flash-boiled everything within a 20-meter radius. Hormagaunts caught in the blast simply ceased to exist, their biomass converted to superheated vapor that rose as a mushroom cloud of organic matter. The ring of Tyranids just beyond the kill zone stumbled backward, chitin armor steaming, bioluminescent markings flickering erratically as their nervous systems tried to process damage beyond their evolutionary parameters. But the swarm adapted. It always adapted. Falco watched warrior forms at the assault's rear begin directing termagant swarms to spread laterally, creating a wider attack front that would envelop the platform's position from multiple angles. A Tyranid prime, massive and ancient, with carapace scarring that spoke of countless battles, pushed through the lesser organisms toward the platform. It stood perhaps 4 meters tall, its upper limbs ending in bone swords longer than a grown man, its lower arms carrying lash whips that crackled with bioelectric discharge. The prime's head crest opened to reveal sensory organs that focused on the figure with predatory intelligence far beyond standard swarm cognition. This was a leader organism, an extension of the hive mind's tactical awareness given physical form. When it shrieked, the sound carried harmonics that made Falco's teeth ache and set every Tyranid within earshot into frenzied motion. The figure responded by dropping into a low stance, arms sweeping outward in arcs that trailed elemental energy. Earth answered first, the platform beneath their feet extending forward in a wave of solidified stone that rolled across the floodplains like a tsunami frozen mid-crash. Tyranids caught in its path were swept upward and forward, carried on the wave's crest before being slammed down with bone-crushing force. The Tyranid prime leaped, clearing the earthen wave in a single bound that demonstrated strength far beyond human capacity. It descended toward the figure with bone swords extended, aiming to impale and eviscerate in one diving strike. The figure spun, water condensing from the humid air into a spiraling barrier that intercepted the prime's blades. The bone swords struck the water shield and stopped, momentum arrested as if they'd hit ceramic plating. For one frozen instant, Tyranid warrior and unknown arrival locked position mere meters apart, close enough that Falco could see the prime's mandibles working in what might have been confusion. Then fire erupted from the figure's right palm, a concentrated lance of blue-white flame that burned hot enough to leave afterimages. The prime twisted mid-air, impossibly agile for something so massive, and took the fire stream across its shoulder instead of center mass.
chitin armor blackened and cracked, the smell of burning alien flesh washing across the battlefield. The Prime hit the ground hard, rolled, came up, already charging again. Its bone sword swung in crossing arcs designed to overwhelm any defensive position through sheer speed and angles of attack. The figure met the assault with air, hands moving in rapid gestures that created focused wind currents strong enough to deflect the blades by centimeters. Each sword strike passed within a hand's breadth of flesh, but never connected, turned aside by precisely calculated pressure differentials. The combat became a dance, Tyranid strength and aggression countered by elemental manipulation that turned the battlefield itself into weapon and shield. Captain Falco finally grabbed the Vox handset and keyed regimental command. The response was immediate, Colonel Verse's voice tight with barely controlled panic as reports flooded in from across the front. The Tyranid assault had faltered sector-wide, swarm cohesion degrading as if the hive mind's attention had been forcibly redirected. Forward observers reported similar figures appearing at multiple locations across Pelagos Reach, each one descending from the ash clouds and engaging Tyranid forces with the same elemental attacks. The captain demanded clarification, wanted to know if this was some undocumented Adeptus deployment or perhaps inquisitorial operatives using Xenos tech beyond standard classification. Falco stared down at the figure still dueling the Tyranid Prime and tried to formulate an answer that wouldn't sound like battle fatigue or heretical psyker activity or warp-touched madness. He settled for unknown combatant engaging Xenos with what appears to be elemental manipulation. No Imperial authorization codes detected. Recommend observation and threat assessment before engagement. The Colonel's response was predictable and doctrinally sound. All units were to maintain defensive positions and observe, but not engage unless the unknown combatant proved hostile to Imperial forces. If the arrival demonstrated heretical psyker activity or warp corruption, immediate elimination was authorized pending commissariat approval. Falco acknowledged the order and continued watching the battle below, acutely aware that every second of observation added to his own culpability if this turned out to be some elaborate chaos corruption.
But he couldn't look away. The combat had entered a phase of escalation that defied every tactical principle he'd learned across 18 years of Imperial Guard service. The Tyranid Prime had been joined by 2 more warrior organisms, the trio coordinating their assault with the kind of tactical sophistication usually reserved for Hive Tyrant command nodes. They attacked in rotation, one engaging while the others maneuvered for flanking strikes, forcing the figure to divide attention across multiple vectors. The figure's response was to stop moving defensively and instead create terrain. A gesture brought a wall of earth erupting from the ground on the left flank, blocking sightlines and forcing the flanking warrior to either climb or go around. Another gesture sent a wave of superheated air washing across the right approach, heat intense enough that the second warrior's advance slowed as its cooling vents struggled to prevent systemic overheating. The Prime itself faced the figure directly, pressing the attack with bone sword combinations that should have overwhelmed any individual combatant through sheer volume of lethal threat. But the figure had begun combining elements in ways that suggested either deep training or instinctive mastery. Fire and air merged to create combustion vortexes that spun like miniature tornadoes, each one hot enough to melt chitin on contact. Fire scorched the leading edge. Water followed, flash cooling superheated chitin and causing thermal fractures. Air pressure slammed into the fractured armor like a physical blow. Earth rose beneath stumbling Tyranids and locked them in place as the ground solidified around their limbs. The Tyranid Prime broke free through raw strength, its exoskeleton cracked and leaking ichor, but its killing intent undiminished. It charged directly through the settling elemental storm, bone swords raised for a decapitating strike. The figure didn't retreat. Instead, they stepped forward into the attack, hands moving in patterns too fast to follow with unenhanced eyes. Fire and air merged around the right hand, forming what looked like a spear of solid flame. Water and earth coalesced around the left, creating a staff of compressed stone wrapped in flowing liquid. The figure spun, weapons that weren't weapons but extensions of elemental control, and met the Prime's assault with precision that spoke of combat training measured in years or decades. The flame spear parried the first bone sword in a clash that sent sparks of blue-white fire scattering across the mud. The stone staff caught the second blade, water flowing around the point of impact to disperse kinetic force across the staff's entire length. They fought at close quarters for perhaps 10 seconds, an eternity in combat where each exchange could have proven fatal. The Prime's bone swords moved in patterns optimized through millions of years of Tyranid evolution, each strike calculated to exploit human reaction times and physical limitations. The figure responded with movements that seemed almost predictive, as if reading the Prime's intent through means beyond simple observation. When the Prime attempted a lash whip strike with its lower limbs, the figure was already moving, elemental staff sweeping low to intercept and redirect the bioelectric tendrils harmlessly into the mud. When the Prime tried a headbutt with its armored crest, the figure created a cushion of compressed air that turned the impact into a glancing blow. The exchange ended when the figure caught both bone swords on the crossed weapons, locked the Prime in place through elemental leverage, and then released a point-blank burst of all 4 elements directly into the creature's thorax. The explosion was contained, focused, and absolutely lethal. Fire burned from within, superheating the Prime's internal organs past survivability. Water flash-boiled, building steam pressure that cracked chitin from the inside out. Air compressed and expanded in rapid cycling, creating shockwaves that liquefied tissue. Earth invaded through the cracks, foreign minerals jamming synaptic pathways and disrupting the connection to the hive mind. The Prime stood for 3 seconds after the strike, its sensory organs dimming, bioluminescent markings flickering and dying, then toppled backward like a felled tree, hitting the mud with an impact that sent ripples across the waterlogged ground. The 2 remaining warriors hesitated, their coordination disrupted by the loss of the Prime's tactical direction. The figure took advantage of that hesitation, hands moving in a complex series of gestures that pulled moisture from the air and the ground itself. Water rose in response, gallons becoming hundreds of gallons, coalescing into a sphere suspended between the figure's outstretched hands. The sphere grew until it was large enough to encompass both Tyranid warriors. Then the figure brought their hands together in a crushing motion. The water sphere collapsed inward with hydraulic force that pulped everything inside, pressure intense enough to crack ceramite if applied correctly. When the sphere dispersed, what remained of the warriors fell in pieces, their structural integrity destroyed by compression that had turned chitin armor into shrapnel driven through their own bodies.
The figure stood motionless for a moment, steam rising from their skin, the elemental markings along their arms glowing bright enough to be visible even through Falco's magnoculars, then collapsed to one knee, breathing hard, clearly exhausted despite the devastating effectiveness of the assault. The Tyranid swarm should have pressed the advantage. Standard hive mind tactical doctrine demanded immediate exploitation of enemy weakness, overwhelming vulnerable targets through numerical superiority. Instead, the swarm withdrew, not in rout or panic. Tyranids lacked the capacity for such emotions, but in coordinated redeployment that suggested higher-level strategic recalculation. Falco watched through his magnoculus as hormagaunts and termagants pulled back in organized waves, maintaining defensive spacing that would allow them to reform and counterattack if pursued. The larger bioforms, the warriors and prime equivalents, formed a rear guard that covered the withdrawal with precise positioning. Within minutes, the Tyranid presence on the eastern floodplains had diminished to scattered organisms too damaged to withdraw and a carpet of alien corpses that stretched as far as sensors could detect. The silence that followed felt wrong, pregnant with implications that Falco's tactical training struggled to categorize. The figure on the earthen platform rose slowly, movements suggesting muscle fatigue and perhaps injury, though no visible wounds marked their form. They turned in a slow circle, surveying the battlefield with what Falco interpreted as sorrow or perhaps shock. Their gaze swept across the fields of dead Tyranids, the churned mud, the distant Imperial trench line with its heavy weapons still trained on their position. When those eyes finally settled on Falco's command bunker, he felt the weight of alien attention like physical pressure against his chest. Not hostile, not yet, but measuring, calculating, trying to understand what it had stumbled into. Falco keyed the Vox to regimental command and reported the swarm's withdrawal, the unknown combatant's victory, and his recommendation that first contact protocols be initiated before the situation escalated beyond retrieval. Colonel Verse's response was curt. Specialist teams were already en route. The commissariat had been notified, and Falco was to maintain observation but keep all weapons hot in case the arrival proved treacherous. The specialists arrived within the hour, descending from orbital stations via Valkyrie gunship. Falco recognized the Adeptus Arbitis signatures first, their armor's distinctive profile visible even from a distance. But alongside the Arbitis came figures in robes that marked them as Adeptus Astra Telepathica, sanctioned psychers whose presence meant this situation had already been escalated to the highest threat classification. The final passenger that disembarked from the Valkyrie wore the black carapace and rosette of the Inquisition, their identity obscured by a featureless helmet, but their authority absolute. Falco felt his stomach drop. Inquisitional involvement meant the situation had moved beyond military concern into the realm of existential threat to imperial doctrine itself. Whatever happened next would be measured not in tactical outcomes, but in theological ramifications that could see entire regiments purged for witnessing heresy. The figure remained on the earthen platform, making no aggressive moves as the Imperial delegation approached across the corpse-strewn battlefield. Falco watched through scopes as the Inquisitor halted at 50 meters, well beyond any reasonable melee range, but close enough to verbal communication. Sanctioned psychers flanked the Inquisitor on both sides, their eyes glowing with warp touch, hands already weaving defensive wards that created visible distortions in the air. Arbitis units formed a perimeter with shotguns and shock mauls ready, their movements textbook perfect in establishing overlapping fields of fire. The Inquisitor spoke, voice amplified by voxcasters built into the helmet. The words carried across the floodplains with mechanical clarity, each syllable enunciated with the weight of ancient authority. By the mandate of the God Emperor of mankind and the holy ordos of his Inquisition, you are commanded to identify yourself, state your origin, and submit to psychic examination to determine corruption or taint. Resistance will be met with immediate sanction. Compliance may earn the Emperor's mercy. Speak now or be judged heretic and destroyed. The figure tilted their head. A gesture conveyed confusion more than defiance. When they spoke, their voice carried without amplification, cleared despite distance in a way that suggested air itself was being manipulated to carry sound. The accent was strange, inflections that didn't match any imperial dialect Falco had encountered across 22 worlds and 5 years of continuous deployment. The vocabulary seemed to draw from multiple linguistic roots, some recognizable as degraded High Gothic, others completely foreign, but the intent was unmistakable, conciliatory rather than confrontational. I don't understand where I am or how I arrived here. One moment I was in balance with the elements during meditation, the next I was falling through that sky into this war. I mean no harm to you or yours. I defended myself and those who seem to need defending against the creatures attacking your positions. If I have violated law or custom, it was through ignorance, not malice. Please help me understand what is happening. The Inquisitor's response was immediate and uncompromising. You display abilities consistent with unsanctioned psycho-manifestation, a capital offense under the Lex Imperialis. You engaged in combat without Imperial authorization on a contested war zone, interfering with military operations against a designated Xenos threat. Your origin is unknown, your genetics unverified, your loyalty unproven. You will submit to binding and psychic interrogation immediately, or you will be destroyed. There is no third option. Choose now. Falco saw the figure's posture shift, subtle tension entering their stance. Not the readiness of someone preparing to attack, but the weariness of prey realizing it's cornered. The elemental markings on their arms began to glow brighter, unconscious response to stress or perhaps deliberate warning. The sanctioned psychers flanking the Inquisitor reacted immediately, their own powers flaring as they prepared to counter what they interpreted as hostile manifestation. The air between the two groups began to distort, reality growing thin as warp energies and elemental forces created interference patterns that hurt to observe. Falco's hand moved to the Vox handset, ready to call fire support or evacuation depending on how the next seconds played out. The tension stretched like over-tightened wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure.
Then the figure did something that changed everything. They knelt, slowly, deliberately, lowering themselves to the earthen platform in a posture of submission that nonetheless retained dignity. The elemental energies surrounding them dispersed, flowing back into earth and air and the moisture in the atmosphere. The glow from the tattoos faded to barely visible luminescence. When they spoke again, the voice carried resignation mixed with something that might have been hope. I submit to your examination, but I ask that you try to understand I am not what you think I am. I don't draw power from the source you fear. I work in harmony with the natural elements, maintaining balance rather than imposing will. If you have the ability to detect such things, you'll find no corruption, no external influence, only connection to the world itself. I place myself in your hands and pray you have wisdom to match your strength. The Inquisitor gestured, and Arbite's units moved forward with restraint devices that looked designed to contain Astartes-level threats. Adamantium manacles closed around the figure's wrists and ankles, each one inscribed with purity seals and connected to a central control unit carried by an Arbite sergeant. Psychic wards were placed at cardinal points around the prisoner, their activation creating a cage of warp interference that would theoretically prevent any manifestation of psyker powers. The sanctioned psychers approached cautiously, their third eyes opening to gaze upon the figure's soul with senses that transcended physical observation. Falco watched one of the psychers stumble backward as if struck, their face contorting in confusion. The second psyker maintained contact longer, forehead creased in concentration, before breaking connection and turning to the Inquisitor with hands moving in silent battle K. The Inquisitor's helmet tilted in what might have been surprise. A brief exchange of hand signals followed, the psychers apparently reporting findings that didn't align with expected parameters. Finally, the Inquisitor spoke again, voice still amplified but pitched for privacy that excluded Falco's observation post. You register as a blank space to warp site, not as a null or pariah who actively repels the immaterium, but as if you exist in a separate layer of reality that the warp cannot easily touch. The elements you command respond to you as if you were simply requesting their natural behavior rather than forcing them through imposed will. This is unprecedented, heretical by definition, yet potentially explicable. You will be transported to secure containment for extended examination. Resistance during transport will result in immediate execution. Compliance may lead to understanding. Pray that understanding proves sufficient. The figure was loaded onto the Valkyrie under heavy guard, the Arbites maintaining drawn weapons throughout the process. The sanctioned psychers remained at distance, their continued observations suggesting they were maintaining psychic monitoring even through the warp interference wards.
The Inquisitor boarded last, pausing at the assault ramp to gaze back across the battlefield toward Falco's position. Even at this distance, even through the featureless helmet, Falco felt the weight of inquisitorial attention settle on him like a targeting laser. The message was clear without words. What had been witnessed here was now subject to inquisitorial seal, to be discussed only under direct order and with full awareness that loose tongues could result in summary execution. Falco stood at attention and saluted, the gesture acknowledging both the command and the implicit threat. The Valkyrie lifted with turbine roar, banking toward the orbital stations where interrogation facilities waited. The aftermath brought silence, broken only by the wind across corpse-strewn mud and the distant crackle of still burning fires. Falco stood in the command trench and tried to process what he'd witnessed, tried to fit it into frameworks of imperial doctrine and Xenos threat classification. The categories failed. The figure had demonstrated powers that looked like psyker manifestation, but responded to entirely different principles, had defended imperial positions without request or compensation, then submitted to arrest without resistance, spoke of balance and harmony in a galaxy where the only balance was between annihilation and slightly delayed annihilation. Nothing about it made sense, nothing about it fit. But the Tyranids had withdrawn. That fact remained concrete and undeniable. Across the Eastern Front, swarm elements had pulled back from positions they could have overrun, redeploying toward the planet's northern continent, where reported sightings of additional arrivals had been concentrated. The hive mind was adapting its strategy, either recognizing a new threat that required different tactics, or perhaps simply selecting easier prey. Either way, Pelagos Reach had been granted a reprieve measured in hours or days rather than minutes. The evacuation could continue. More civilians might reach the transport ships. The defense could be reorganized and reinforced, all because something impossible had fallen from the sky and fought with elements instead of faith. Falco remained at his post through the changing of the watch, through the arrival of burial details to begin processing the Tyranid biomass before it could be reclaimed by swarm recycling organisms. He watched the sun set behind ash clouds that never fully parted, turning the sky shades of purple and deep red that reminded him of old paintings depicting the Emperor's final duel with Horus. Melodramatic comparison, perhaps, but appropriate to the moment's weight. Something had changed on Pelagos Reach, something that would ripple outward through imperial hierarchy and potentially reshape understanding of what was possible in a universe that had long ago categorized all possibilities into narrow doctrinal channels. Whether that change would bring salvation or damnation remained to be seen. The Vox crackled with new orders from regimental command. All officers were to report for debriefing regarding the day's events, beginning with the most senior and working downward through the chain of command. Subjects would include tactical observations, personnel actions, and any communications with or observations of the prisoner. The briefing was classified under inquisitorial seal, with all participants reminded that discussion outside designated channels constituted heresy, punishable by immediate execution. Falco acknowledged the order, secured his command post, and began the long walk toward the regimental headquarters bunker. Behind him, the eastern floodplain stretched dark and silent, broken only by the faint glow of bioluminescent markers where dead Tyranids still leaked chemical light into the mud above. The ash clouds had closed again, sealing the sky and whatever mysteries it had briefly revealed. The orbital station, designated Sanctum Veritatis, hung in geosynchronous orbit above Pelagos Reach's equator, a cathedral of steel and stone that served as regional headquarters for the Inquisition's Ordo Xenos operations. Within its armored heart, in a chamber specifically constructed to contain psyker-level threats, the prisoner sat in restraints designed by Adeptus Mechanicus Sense as specialists in Astartes containment. Inquisitor Valen Kuros removed her helmet and set it aside, revealing features marked by decades of service and the faint scarring characteristic of juvenile treatments that had been applied late in life. She studied the prisoner through reinforced armor grise viewing ports, watching the subtle play of light across those strange tattoos, noting the way the prisoner's breathing remained calm despite circumstances that should have induced panic.
The initial psychic examination had been inconclusive in ways that troubled Kuros deeply. Her sanctioned psychers reported that the prisoner registered to Warpsite as a void, not the hungry emptiness of a pariah, but simply absent from the Immaterium's normal patterns. When pressed to manifest their abilities for study, the prisoner had demonstrated elemental manipulation that appeared to draw power from the physical world itself rather than the warp. Earth responded to their gestures by flowing like water. Air compressed and expanded according to precise mental command. Fire ignited from nothing and burned according to will rather than available fuel. Water condensed from atmosphere and shaped itself into structures that defied surface tension physics. All of it accomplished without the telltale warp distortion that accompanied even the most subtle psycho-manifestation. Kuros activated the interrogation chamber's Vox system, her voice carrying into the containment cell with mechanical clarity. You claim to work in harmony with elements rather than imposing will. Explain this process in terms that can be measured and verified. The Imperium does not accept mystery as explanation, only fact and evidence. The prisoner looked up, meeting Kuros's gaze through the armor Christ with eyes that showed fatigue but no fear. Where I come from, all things exist in balance. 4 elements, earth, water, fire, and air, comprise the physical world and everything in it. Those who train extensively can learn to sense this balance and work with it, guiding the elements through technique and discipline, rather than forcing them through external power. It's not domination, but partnership. The elements respond because I ask in ways they understand, not because I compel them against their nature. Your explanation requires accepting that elements possess agency or consciousness, which contradicts fundamental principles of physics and material science. Kuros leaned forward against the viewing port, her reflection overlapping the prisoner's form in the armor Christ. Our Mechanicus adepts would classify your claims as animistic superstition, inconsistent with the omniscious revelation. Yet our observations confirm you accomplish what you claim. Explain this paradox. I don't claim the elements think as you or I think, but they exist in patterns, flows of energy and matter that can be redirected if you understand their nature. Water flows downward because of its nature, but it can be redirected through channels or lifted through pressure. Fire consumes because that's its nature. Kuros pulled back from the viewing port and gestured for her Lex Mechanic to begin recording. This conversation was moving into territory that would require extensive theological review. You say you've trained since childhood. Describe your origin, your homeworld, and the civilization that developed these techniques. Comprehensive detail, omitting nothing. The prisoner took a breath and began to speak. They described a world very different from the Imperium's endless sprawl, a planet where 4 distinct nations represented the physical philosophies and where balance between them was maintained through careful political and spiritual alignment. They spoke of training monasteries where discipline and meditation were considered as important as combat technique, of masters who had achieved harmony with their chosen element through decades of practice. They described a conflict that had threatened this balance, a war that spanned continents and cost countless lives before a figure emerged who could bend all 4 elements, restoring peace through demonstrated mastery of the complete cycle. The story had mythic overtones that reminded Kuros of pre-unification Terran legends, tales before the Emperor's revelation unified humanity under singular truth. This avatar you describe, the one who mastered all 4 elements and ended your world's war, what became of them? Kuros watched the prisoner's face carefully, looking for deception or evasion. Where they restored balance and then stepped away from power, believing that true peace required all nations working together, rather than being ruled by a single individual, no matter how powerful. The Avatar's role was to enable balance, not enforce it. I was told this story many times during my training, taught to understand that power exists to serve harmony rather than domination. The prisoner's expression held something that might have been grief or longing.
I was studying at one of the air temples when something happened. Reality itself seemed to crack around me. I remember pain, disorientation, the sensation of falling through infinite distance. Then I was here, in your war, surrounded by death on a scale I'd never imagined possible. Kuros processed this, her mind working through implications that ranged from warp storm displacement to Xenos tech accident to possibilities she didn't have vocabulary to name. You described displacement from one reality to another, suggesting either stable warp phenomenon or technology far beyond Imperial classification. Neither explanation is remotely acceptable without evidence. Yet here you stand, demonstrably real and demonstrably impossible. I'm forced to conclude you're either the most sophisticated liar I've encountered in 40 years of service, or you're telling the truth, and the Imperium's understanding of reality has critical gaps. I don't ask you to believe me without proof, only to examine what I can do and make judgment based on evidence rather than assumption. The prisoner raised their manacled hands as much as the restraints allowed. Test me, study me. I'll cooperate fully because I need your help as much as you apparently need to understand me. I'm stranded in a galaxy I don't recognize, surrounded by wars I don't understand, facing threats I've never encountered. If there's a way back to my world, I'll need assistance finding it. If there's no way back, I'll need to find purpose here. Either way, proving I'm not a threat to you or yours benefits us both.
Pragmatic, logical, completely reasonable, which made Kuros more suspicious rather than less, because in her experience, genuine heretics often displayed the most reasonable facades. But the prisoner had a point. Continued testing would provide data that confession or torture never could. She keyed the Vox to her Lex Mechanic. Prepare the examination suite for extended study. I want full spectrum analysis of any manifestations, including gravitrometric sensors, radiation monitoring, and warp distortion metrics. If the prisoner is willing to demonstrate abilities under controlled conditions, we'll gather empirical evidence and build an understanding from observable fact. The testing began within the hour and continued for 3 days without pause. The prisoner demonstrated earth manipulation by reshaping a provided stone block into geometric shapes that would have required precision cutting tools. Mechanica sensors registered fluctuations in local electromagnetic fields and minor gravitrometric distortions, but absolutely no warp signature. Water was drawn from sealed containers and formed into structures that held stable for minutes before being released. Sensors registered temperature changes and pressure variations consistent with physical manipulation, but again, no warp touch. Fire was generated through what appeared to be rapid oxidation acceleration, burning without fuel in defiance of thermodynamic principles, yet producing heat signatures identical to standard combustion. Air was compressed into visible vortexes that generated measurable pressure differentials and sonic effects. Every test produced results that confirmed the prisoner's abilities while simultaneously confounding attempts to explain them through existing imperial science. The Mechanicus adepts argued among themselves, their theological positions dividing along factional lines. Some insisted this was simply unclassified Xenos tech, perhaps artifacts of the dark age of technology that had achieved symbiosis with a human host. Others argued for warp phenomenon so subtle that current detection methods couldn't register it properly. A minority, quickly silenced by their more orthodox colleagues, suggested this might represent an entirely different classification of power, something the Imperium had simply never encountered because it existed outside the warp-materium dichotomy that defined all previous understanding. Inquisitor Kuros compiled the reports and forwarded them to higher authority within the Ordo Xenos, including a recommendation that was unprecedented in her career: provisional cooperation. The prisoner had demonstrated both capability and willingness to work within Imperial framework. They had submitted to examination without resistance, answered questions honestly, as far as verification could determine, and, most critically, had already proven effective against tyrannid bioforms during the initial contact, with Hive Fleet Molochs still threatening Pelagus Reach and surrounding systems. Kuros argued that rejecting a potential asset out of doctrinal rigidity would constitute dereliction of duty. The prisoner could be contained, studied, and utilized against Xenos threats while long-term theological evaluation continued.
The response from Inquisitorial Command came within 18 hours, faster than any decision Kuros had seen in her decades of service. Permission was granted for limited field deployment under strict supervision, with termination protocols standing ready at all times. The asset would be designated Asset Epsilon for classification purposes, their true nature remaining sealed under inquisitorial authority. They would be assigned to Captain Ren Falco's regiment, both because Falco had proven capable of rational response under pressure and because his troops had already been exposed to the situation, reducing security complications. Magos biologist Chakran would accompany the deployment to continue studies and provide technical analysis. Sanctioned psyker Choir Mistress Velen would maintain psychic oversight and serve as final sanction if the asset proved treacherous. Inquisitor Kuros delivered the news to the prisoner personally, watching their face for reaction to terms that would have sent any normal individual into despair. You will be deployed to the surface under military authority. You will engage Tyranid forces as directed by Imperial Command. You will submit to continued study and observation at all times. Any deviation from orders, any manifestation of ability beyond authorized parameters, any behavior that suggests corruption or disloyalty will result in immediate termination. You will be watched every moment by individuals whose entire purpose is to kill you if necessary. Do you accept these terms? The prisoner nodded slowly. Exhaustion evident in the movement, but determination clear in their voice. I accept. I'll fight your war, submit to your study, and prove through action that I'm not the threat you fear. Just give me the chance to show what balance can accomplish, even here. Kuros almost pitied them. Almost. Because what the prisoner didn't understand, couldn't possibly understand without witnessing the full scope of the galaxy's horrors, was that balance had no place in the 41st millennium. There was only survival measured in blood and the grinding calculus of acceptable losses. Whatever world the prisoner had come from, whatever philosophy of harmony they carried, it would be tested against realities that broke stronger souls than theirs. If they survived the testing, perhaps they would learn. If they didn't, their death would at least provide valuable data for the Ordo Xenos archives. Either outcome served the Imperium. The Aquila-class lander descended through Pelagus Reach's atmosphere, with the prisoner secured in a reinforced transport cage, flanked by Arbites guards and under the watchful third eye of Choir Mistress Velen. Magos biologist Chakran occupied a separate compartment, surrounded by sensing equipment that filled the air with machine code prayers and diagnostic hymns. The Landis pilot, a Navy armsman with 80 confirmed combat drops, handled the atmospheric entry with professional detachment. Despite the unusual nature of the cargo, Pelagus Reach spread below them in shades of gray and brown, its natural beauty buried beneath the scars of 3 months' warfare. Captain Ren Falco waited at the designated landing coordinates, a reinforced supply depot that had been converted to forward command for the Eastern Front's reorganization.
He'd received his orders 6 hours prior, delivered by encrypted Vox and countersigned by both Inquisitorial Authority and the Lord General commanding Pelagos Reach Defense Forces. The asset being delivered to his command was to be treated as a combination of strategic weapon and observation subject, deployed against Xenos forces but never trusted, utilized but never integrated. Falco had read the orders 3 times, trying to determine if this was genuine directive or some elaborate loyalty test designed to identify officers who might question inquisitorial wisdom. He'd concluded it didn't matter which. Orders were orders, and in the Imperial Guard you followed them until death or relief, whichever came first. The lander touched down with the gentle impact of expert piloting, its landing gear settling into mud that had been reinforced with plasteel mats. Falco stood at attention as the assault ramp lowered, revealing the prisoner flanked by so much security that deployment seemed unnecessary. But as the entourage disembarked and the prisoner emerged into Pelagos Reach's gray daylight, Falco saw something that all the reports hadn't prepared him for. The figure moved with grace despite restraints, head turning to take in the devastated landscape with what looked like genuine sorrow. Those strange tattoos glowed faintly in the dim light, pulsing in rhythm that Falco realized matched the prisoner's heartbeat. This was no weapon in human form, no sanctioned psyker burned hollow by warp touch. This was someone who had stumbled into nightmare and was trying desperately to make sense of it.
Choir Mistress Velan approached first, her third eye open and glowing with warp light, her staff crackling with barely contained energy. She was ancient by imperial standards, her body sustained past natural lifespan by juvenat treatments and psychic will, her mind carrying scars from decades of service. She studied Falco with senses that transcended physical observation, judging his loyalty and mental state before speaking. "Captain, the asset is delivered to your command as ordered. You will receive operational briefing from Magos Chakron regarding deployment parameters and study requirements. I will maintain oversight and provide psychic monitoring. You are reminded that the asset's termination is authorized at my discretion should corruption manifest. Understood, Choir Mistress." We have prepared containment facilities and integrated the asset into tactical planning as directed. Falco met the old psyker's gaze without flinching, aware she was measuring his soul for weakness or doubt. "May I speak with the asset to establish command relationship?" Velan nodded fractionally. Briefly, "Remember, it is not Imperial Guard. It does not understand chain of command as you do. Clarity and simplicity in your instructions will serve better than military formality." Falco approached the prisoner, stopping at a respectful distance that acknowledged both their humanity and the danger they represented. "I am Captain Ren Falco, commanding the Pelagos 4th Regiment, Eastern Front. You're being attached to my command for tactical deployment against Xenos forces. I need to know what to call you and what capabilities you can reliably provide in combat situations." The prisoner's face showed something like gratitude at being addressed directly, rather than discussed as property. "My name is Kyle. I can manipulate earth, water, fire, and air through trained technique. In combat, I can create defensive barriers, attack at range through elemental projection, and alter terrain to provide tactical advantage. My abilities are most effective when I have time to prepare and can work in coordination with existing forces rather than operating alone. I've never fought the creatures I encountered when I first arrived here. I'll need instruction on their capabilities and vulnerabilities." Practical, combat-focused, exactly what Falco needed to hear. The Xenos are tyrannids, extragalactic organisms that consume all biological matter and adapt rapidly to any threat. They operate through hive-mind intelligence, meaning individual organisms are expendable and will sacrifice themselves to achieve tactical objectives. Standard engagement doctrine emphasizes concentrated fire to overwhelm regeneration capacity and disrupt synapse networks that coordinate swarm activity. Your demonstrated ability to eliminate leader organisms could prove strategically valuable if properly coordinated with Imperial fire support. Kyle nodded, processing the information with visible concentration. Magos biologist Chakron approached, robes rustling with the servo motors and mechanodendrites that extended from beneath the fabric. The Magos's voice emerged from a Vox synthesizer implanted in their throat, mechanical precision replacing biological speech. "Asset Epsilon will be monitored continuously during deployment. Noospheric sensors have been integrated into the combat zone to record all manifestations for later analysis. The asset's restraints will be removed only during active combat operations and reapplied immediately upon mission completion. This protocol is non-negotiable and supersedes all tactical considerations." Falco acknowledged the Magos' authority while internally calculating how those restrictions would affect combat effectiveness. Fighting with the knowledge that any moment could bring re-imprisonment would undermine even the most disciplined warrior's performance. But he'd learned long ago that questioning Mechanicus protocols only resulted in lengthy theological lectures that solved nothing.
Instead, he focused on what he could control, integrating this unusual asset into defensive operations in ways that maximized their effectiveness while satisfying inquisitorial oversight requirements. The first test deployment came within hours. Tyrannid swarm elements had been detected massing near settlement Hadron 7, a minor agricultural collective that still housed approximately 12,000 civilians in the process of evacuation. The settlement's planetary defense militia had fortified a perimeter but lacked the heavy weapons necessary to repel a determined assault. Standard Imperial response would have been to withdraw the militia and abandon the civilians to their fate, preserving military assets for battles where victory was achievable. But with Asset Epsilon available, Falco saw opportunity for both tactical success and observation under controlled conditions. He ordered his regiment's 3rd Company to deploy in support of the settlement's defense, with Kyle integrated into the force structure under Choir Mistress Velen's direct supervision. The deployment utilized Chimera transports, their tracks churning through mud that had become the dominant terrain feature across Pelagos Reach's eastern continent. Kyle rode in Falco's command Chimera, seated across from the captain, positioned to maintain line of sight at all times. The journey took 90 minutes, traveling across devastated farmland where grain fields had been burned to prevent Tyranid biomass reclamation. Falco used the time to brief Kyle on the tactical situation, using a data slate to display Settlement Hadron 7's layout and the predicted Tyranid approach vectors. Tactical briefing. The settlement has 3 main defensive lines. Outer perimeter is earthwork barriers topped with razor wire and firing positions for militia lasgun teams. Middle perimeter is the settlement's original walls, reinforced plasteel that will slow but not stop Tyranid penetration. Inner perimeter is the central hab blocks where civilians are sheltering. If the outer perimeter falls, we'll conduct fighting withdrawal to the middle perimeter while evacuation transports continue loading civilians. If the middle perimeter fails, we hold the inner perimeter until all civilians are evacuated or until our position becomes untenable. Falco looked up from the data slate to meet Kyle's eyes. Your role is to reinforce the outer perimeter by creating terrain obstacles that disrupt Tyranid approach vectors. Earth walls, fire barriers, anything that slows their advance and channels them into concentrated kill zones. Questions? Kyle studied the tactical display, fingers tracing the settlement's layout. The outer perimeter's eastern side has natural elevation advantage but poor sight lines due to remaining vegetation. I could clear the sight lines with controlled burns, then create raised earth platforms to give your heavy weapons teams better firing positions. The western approach is flat and open, perfect for creating a maze of stone walls that force the Tyranids into narrow channels where your weapons can achieve maximum effectiveness. Would that align with your tactical requirements? Falco felt a surge of something he hadn't expected: professional respect. Kyle grasped tactical principles despite having no apparent military training, understood how terrain modification could support rather than replace conventional firepower. That's exactly what we need. Execute those modifications when we arrive, but save energy for combat operations. The swarm could hit us at any time, and I need you capable of sustained action once fighting begins. Settlement fortifications. The convoy reached Settlement Hadron 7 as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the ash clouds shades of amber and rust. The settlement looked like 10,000 others scattered across Imperial agri-worlds, prefab hab blocks arranged in efficient grids, storage silos dominating the skyline, landing pads for bulk haulers now mostly empty. But the fortifications were new, hasty works that spoke to desperation rather than planning. Militia personnel moved along the outer perimeter with the nervous energy of civilians playing soldier, their lasguns held with grips that suggested training measured in days rather than years. Falco deployed his 3rd Company with practiced efficiency, heavy weapons teams taking positions along the outer perimeter, while infantry platoons established fallback positions at the middle perimeter. Kyle was given 12 guardsmen as security detail and directed toward the outer perimeter's critical points. The transformation began immediately. Kyle knelt and placed both hands against the ground, eyes closing in concentration that made the tattoos flare bright enough to cast shadows. Earth responded, flowing like water as Kyle's will reshaped it into walls and platforms that rose from mud with impossible smoothness. Stone formed from compressed minerals, surfaces hardening to ceramite equivalent density. The guardsmen assigned to security watched with expressions ranging from awe to barely concealed fear, their hands never straying far from weapons despite orders to protect rather than threaten. Magos Chakron followed at a distance, mechadendrites extended to capture every detail with recording devices that clicked and whirred like mechanical insects. The eastern perimeter's vegetation clearance came next. Kyle stood and swept both arms in a controlled arc. Fire ignited in response, spreading along precisely defined vectors that consumed dry scrub and obscuring brush while leaving the earthwork barriers untouched.
The flames burned hotter than natural combustion should allow, consuming their fuel in seconds and leaving only ash that settled like gray snow. Militia personnel scrambled away from the advancing fire line, several shouting warnings about uncontrolled wildfire before they realized the flames stopped exactly where Kyle directed them. Within 30 minutes, the eastern approach had been cleared of all concealment, and raised earth platforms provided firing positions with commanding fields of fire.
The western perimeter's maze took longer, requiring more precise manipulation to create the desired effect. Kyle drew stone from deep earth, pulling it upward in walls that rose to 3-meter height and formed a labyrinth of narrow passages radiating from the perimeter toward the open plain beyond. The design was elegant in its simplicity. Any Tyranid force approaching from the west would be funneled into the maze's entrance corridors, constrained to movement patterns that eliminated their numerical advantage and turned their mass into a liability. Heavy bolter teams positioned at key intersections would create overlapping fields of fire that turned each passage into a killing ground. Falco walked the maze once it was complete, marveling at construction that would have taken combat engineers with full equipment weeks to accomplish. Kyle worked outside the immaterium's touch, drawing power from the material world through mechanisms that defied standard categorization. Velen had consulted the most obscure texts in the Inquisition's libraries, searching for precedent or explanation. The closest she'd found were pre-unification legends from Terra's ancient cultures, stories of individuals who worked miracles through harmony with nature rather than divine intercession or warp sorcery. Those legends had been dismissed as superstition by the imperial truth, relegated to historical curiosity rather than theological significance. But watching Kyle reshape terrain through elemental command, Velen wondered if the dismissal had been premature. The Tyranids came with the setting sun, announced by the rumble of countless footfalls and the chittering hiss that always preceded a major assault. Auspex readings showed a swarm composition heavy on assault organisms. Hormagaunts and gene stealers formed the vanguard, with warrior bioforms providing synapse coordination. No large creatures were detected, suggesting this was a probing attack designed to test defenses rather than achieve breakthrough. Falco watched the tactical displays and issued orders with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this dozens of times before. Heavy weapons teams cleared to engage at maximum range, mortar teams receiving targeting coordinates, infantry platoons reminded to maintain fire discipline and watch their sectors. Kyle received the simple instruction that would determine whether this unprecedented deployment proved valuable or disastrous. Hold the outer perimeter.
Tyranid Assault Breakdown. The first Hormagaunts entered the western maze at full sprint, their claws scrabbling against stone as they poured through the entrance corridors in a tide of chitin and fang. They moved with the coordination of swarm intelligence, spreading across multiple passages to prevent bunching that would make them vulnerable to area effect weapons. But Kyle had anticipated this, designing the maze with bottlenecks positioned precisely where heavy bolter crossfire could achieve maximum effect. Western Maze Slaughter. Tyranids ran directly into overlapping fields of fire that turned the passages into meat grinders, mass-reactive bolts detonating inside alien bodies, spraying chitin fragments and steaming ichor across stone walls. Dynamic defense. Hormagaunts died in dozens, then hundreds, their corpses piling up to create obstacles that forced following organisms to climb over their own dead. Elemental adaptation. When Hormagaunts attempted to scale the walls, earth flowed upward to extend the barriers beyond their reach. Gene stealers using superior climbing ability were slammed back by air currents with bone-breaking force. Fire swept through passages where Tyranid density became too concentrated, flash cooking the leading organisms and creating barriers of burning biomass. Water was saved for the warrior bioforms, condensing from humid air into spheres that engulfed the synapse creatures and collapsed inward with hydraulic force, crushing their reinforced carapaces. Captain Falco watched from the command post and felt something he rarely experienced in this war: hope. Not desperate survival hope, but genuine tactical hope based on capabilities that exceeded initial projections. Kyle wasn't just holding the outer perimeter, they were dominating it, turning the Tyranid assault into a slow-motion disaster for the swarm. Casualty ratios that normally favored the Xenos 10-1 had inverted, guardsmen killing Tyranids at rates approaching 20-1, with ammunition expenditure well below predicted consumption rates. The elemental barriers and terrain modifications did work that would normally require artillery support or armored reinforcement. But the swarm adapted. It always adapted. Falco saw it in the tactical displays first, swarm elements pulling back from the western maze and redeploying toward the eastern approach where Kyle's defensive modifications were less comprehensive. The Tyranids had recognized the maze as a kill zone and sought alternate attack vectors with cold calculation. Eastern Perimeter Climax. Falco voxed warnings and ordered Kyle to shift position, knowing it might be too late. Kyle sprinted along the outer perimeter, guardsmen struggling to keep pace, arriving as the first wave of gene stealers emerged from ash-shrouded distance with horrifying speed. These weren't scuttling hormagaunts or methodical warriors. Gene stealers were living weapons perfected across millennia. Upper limbs ending in rending claws that could shear through power armor, intelligence high enough to employ tactics. They hit in scattered formation from multiple simultaneous attacks from unpredictable vectors. Kyle responded with something Falco had never seen in 18 years of warfare: a whirlwind. Air currents spinning at velocities creating visible distortion, a miniature tornado forming as defensive barrier and expanding to catch incoming gene stealers. The Xenos organisms were lifted off their feet and spun at speeds that would liquefy unarmored humans. When released, they fell in a circle of broken bodies, internal organs ruptured by rotational forces. Survivors faced a wall of fire igniting the very air around Kyle, burning hot enough that chitin armor blistered from proximity. The gene stealers retreated, not in panic but tactical reassessment, pulling back into ash clouds. The eastern perimeter fell silent except for dissipating flames and wounded guardsmen's groans. Falco's status check revealed 43 wounded, 11 dead, versus 2,000+ Tyranid casualties, a victory ratio existing only in propaganda, except this time it was real, verified by observers and Magus Chakran's sensors.
Kyle collapsed from exhaustion, guardsmen catching them as choir mistress Valin conducted psychic examination. Her third eye blazed, finding no corruption, just a human soul burning with determination. "The asset is exhausted but uncompromised," she announced. "Manifestations consistent with previous observations. No warp distortion detected. Recommend medical evaluation and rest." Falco nodded slowly. "That's all any of us can do. Fight our war and hope it means something." The deployments continued across the following weeks, each one expanding Kyle's operational parameters as success after success demonstrated both capability and loyalty. Settlement defenses became Kyle's specialty, using elemental manipulation to transform desperate positions into fortified strongpoints that even Tyranid swarms struggled to crack. The reputation spread through the regiment, then to other units, then across the entire Eastern Front. Asset Epsilon, the elemental warrior who bent the very world to military purpose. Guardsmen began requesting assignment to operations where Kyle would be deployed, viewing the asset as luck made manifest in a war where luck was usually measured by how quickly you died.
Command eventually stopped requiring inquisitorial approval for each deployment, granting Captain Falco standing authorization to utilize the asset as tactical situations demanded. But the Tyranids continued to adapt. Each engagement taught the hive mind more about this new threat, allowing it to develop counter-tactics and specialized organisms. Spore mines began appearing in advance of major assaults, living bombs that detonated when Kyle's elemental barriers triggered proximity sensors. Bioacid became more common in the Tyranid arsenal, eating through stone walls and negating earth defenses. Larger creatures started appearing, carnifexes and trigons, whose mass and resilience made them difficult targets for elemental attacks designed to counter swarm organisms. Hive Tyrant deployment. The turning point came 6 weeks after Kyle's initial deployment, when long-range Auspex detected a Hive Tyrant descending toward Pelagos Reach's eastern continent. This wasn't just a synapse creature or leader organism. This was a living weapon of such sophistication that it represented the hive mind's will made flesh, a biotitan capable of coordinating entire planetary assaults while personally destroying anything that stood against it. The tyrant's approach had been tracked for 3 days as it descended from orbit, surrounded by gargoyle swarms and mycetic spores carrying its support organisms. Every calculation showed it heading towards Settlement Prometheus 9, the largest remaining civilian concentration on the Eastern Front, with nearly 90,000 souls still awaiting evacuation. Imperial Command convened an emergency tactical conference. The Lord General laid out the situation with brutal honesty. Standard doctrine called for immediate evacuation of all military assets from Prometheus 9, abandoning the civilians to buy time. But with evacuation ships at maximum capacity, sacrificing 90,000 citizens was unconscionable. Falco spoke up. Asset Epsilon has demonstrated capability against Tyranid leader organisms. With proper support and tactical planning, I believe engagement of the Hive Tyrant is possible. Approved. The deployment took every transport vehicle the regiment could muster, chimeras and tauroxes racing across devastated farmland, while Valkyrie gunships provided aerial cover. Kyle rode unrestrained for the first time, partial, tactical trust that meant something. Settlement Prometheus 9 was a refugee city swollen to 90,000, infrastructure groaning under the strain. The Hive Tyrant arrived with dawn, descending on 30-meter membranous wings that shattered windows with pressure waves. It landed on the outer wall and roared, the sound carrying harmonics that made structure supports vibrate in resonance. Falco gave the order to commence firing, knowing it was futile but doctrinally required. Las cannons engaged from fortified positions, their beams designed to punch through armor plating and cook crews inside armored vehicles.
The shots struck the Hive Tyrant's carapace and left scorch marks, nothing more. The creature's chitinous armor had evolved to disperse energy weapons, spreading heat across its entire surface rather than allowing penetration at any single point. Heavy bolters fired next, their mass-reactive rounds exploding against the tyrant's hide in sequences that should have torn through any organic material. The tyrant ignored them, its regeneration already sealing minor wounds as quickly as they formed. When it returned fire, the settlement's northern wall simply ceased to exist, dissolved by bioacid spray that ate through reinforced plasteel like water through paper. Kyle emerged from the administratum building and stood in the central square, watching the tyrant tear through defensive positions with casual contempt. Tyrant versus Kyle. This was different from fighting swarm organisms. Those creatures operated on instinct and hive coordination, predictable in their aggression and vulnerable to tactics that exploited their programming. The tyrant possessed genuine intelligence, cunning that allowed it to recognize threats and adapt in real time. It would see Kyle coming, it would understand the danger and respond with everything evolution had provided to kill unusual threats. Engaging it would mean fighting something designed specifically to kill things that shouldn't exist.
But 90,000 civilians were dying behind defenses that couldn't hold, and Kyle had made a promise to prove themselves through action. They reached inward, finding the center of calm that all Avatar training began with, the place where fear existed but didn't control. Earth, water, fire, and air, the fundamental elements that comprised all physical reality. Kyle drew them close, feeling the resistance from Pelagos's Reach's poisoned systems, but pushing through it anyway. Energy flowed through the tattoos that marked their body, building to levels that made vision blur and muscles tremble. This would be the largest manifestation yet attempted, the kind of elemental manipulation that risked permanent damage if sustained too long. But the tyrant had to be stopped, and stopping it required power on a scale Kyle had only achieved once before. The Hive Tyrant noticed Kyle moving across the settlement toward its position. The creature's sensory organs locked onto this new threat, analyzing heat signature and movement patterns through senses beyond human capacity. It recognized danger in ways the swarm organisms couldn't, saw the elemental energies gathering around this small figure, and calculated threat assessment. The tyrant's bioweapons swiveled to target Kyle, flesh-borer organisms preparing to launch living ammunition designed to penetrate and consume from within. But before it could fire, Kyle attacked first. Elemental assault. Earth erupted from below the tyrant's position, rising in pillars that attempted to entrap its limbs and prevent flight. The creature tore free through raw strength, its lower arms shattering stone that should have held adamantium. Water formed next, gallons condensing from the air to create a sphere around the tyrant's head, attempting to drown or at minimum blind it. The tyrant's bioelectric field vaporized the water before it could close, turning the attack into steam that obscured visibility for both combatants. Fire came as a lance of superheated plasma, temperatures approaching what starship engines produced during atmospheric entry. The tyrant's carapace absorbed the heat and channeled it away, its cooling vents flaring open to disperse excess energy. Air compressed into focused projectiles that struck like artillery shells, impact force sufficient to crack the settlement wall behind the tyrant. The creature swayed but held position, its mass too great for wind alone to overcome. Kyle combined elements, forming attacks that merged fire and air into superheated vortexes, water and earth into mud that flash-hardened to stone. Each strike pushed the Hive Tyrant backward incrementally, forcing it to work for every meter it advanced. But Kyle was tiring rapidly, the sustained manifestation draining reserves faster than meditation could restore. The tyrant recognized this, could somehow sense the weakening in its opponent's attacks. It pressed forward with renewed aggression, bioweapons firing at last. Living ammunition streaked across the distance, organisms designed to penetrate and consume from within. Kyle created air barriers that deflected most of the projectiles, but one penetrated, striking their left shoulder and burrowing inward before earth manipulation could crush it. Pain exploded through Kyle's nervous system, the organism's digestive acids eating muscle and the beginning of bone. Falco watched from the command post and felt the battle turning. Kyle was magnificent, demonstrating power on scales that rewrote understanding of what was possible. But the tyrant was winning through simple attrition, its evolutionary advantages proving superior to elemental manipulation in this specific engagement. He grabbed the Vox handset and screamed for fire support, ordering every remaining heavy weapon to concentrate fire on the tyrant's position. The response was immediate. Las cannons and heavy bolters and plasma weapons, all engaging in synchronized volleys that turned the battlefield into a storm of energy and explosive rounds. The tyrant absorbed the punishment, but even its regeneration had limits. Cracks appeared in its carapace, ichor leaked from wounds that weren't closing immediately. The creature's advance slowed as it was forced to dedicate biological resources to survival rather than offense. Kyle saw the opening and took it, all four elements flowing together in harmony, earth and water forming the foundation, fire and air providing the explosive force.
They brought both hands together and then separated them in a pulling motion that seemed to tear reality itself. The elements responded with everything Pelagos Reach's dying systems could provide, surging upward through Kyle's body and outward in a wave that combined all principles of Avatar combat into a single devastating attack. Stone spikes erupted beneath the tyrant, impaling its lower limbs and locking it in place. Water formed around the impaled creature and froze instantly, not through temperature reduction, but through molecular bonding that turned liquid into solid in defiance of thermodynamic principles. Fire ignited inside the ice, superheating water that couldn't expand and building pressure that had nowhere to release. Air compressed around the entire formation and then released in a shockwave that propagated through the ice with shattering force. The hive tyrant exploded. Not in the dramatic sense of Hollywood destruction, but in the surgical precision of structural failure at the molecular level. Its carapace fractured along stress lines that the combined elemental assault had created. Internal organs liquefied from alternating freeze and burn. The bioelectric field that had protected it collapsed as neural pathways failed. When the attack finished and the elements dispersed, what remained was barely recognizable as having once been a living creature. The tyrant's remains fell in pieces, its biomass scattering across the settlement's northern approach in patterns that would have looked abstract if they weren't so obviously organic. Silence followed. The kind of absolute quiet that happens when everyone witnessing an event simultaneously stops breathing. Then cheering erupted from the settlement walls, guardsmen and militia screaming victory with voices raw from smoke inhalation and fear. Civilians who had been cowering in hab blocks emerged to see the fallen tyrant, their faces showing the kind of wonder that made Falco's chest tight with emotions he'd forgotten existed. Kyle stood at the attack's epicenter, swaying on their feet, the shoulder wound still bleeding and the tattoos dim almost to invisibility. They'd given everything, pushed past safety margins and endurance limits to achieve what doctrine said was impossible. Then they collapsed, and this time no one caught them. The medical response was immediate. Aftermath. Regimental medics rushed to stabilize the asset while Choir Mistress Velen conducted emergency psychic examination to determine if the massive manifestation had created warp vulnerabilities or corruption. The shoulder wound was cleaned and treated, the burrowing organism extracted before it could reach vital structures. Exhaustion was addressed through intravenous fluids and stimulants that wouldn't restore true energy but would prevent systemic shutdown. Kyle drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of activity around them but unable to focus or respond coherently. The dreams that came were fragmented, memories of home mixed with the horrors of Pelagos Reach, meditation techniques overlapping with combat trauma. Through it all ran a thread of grief for what had been lost and determination to survive what came next. They woke 3 days later in a proper medical facility, having been transported to one of the orbital stations while unconscious. The restraints were absent, a detail Kyle noticed before anything else. Their arms were free, though movements sent pain through the healing shoulder. Choir Mistress Velen sat in a chair beside the bed, her third eye closed but her staff within easy reach. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the suspicion that had characterized their earlier interactions. "You nearly died. The damage from the burrowing organism combined with exhaustion from manifestation at that scale should have killed you. Our medics believe you survived only because your connection to the elements provided some form of regenerative support beyond normal human capacity. Magos Chekron has 300 questions about the mechanisms involved." Kyle's voice was rough when they spoke. "Did we save them, the Prometheus 9? All 90,000 evacuated successfully while you fought the Hive Tyrant. Your sacrifice bought time for the transports to complete their mission. Many are calling it a miracle. The Ecclesiarchy is already trying to determine if what you accomplished qualifies for inclusion in the Imperial Creed. Inquisitor Kuros is blocking those efforts until theological implications can be properly assessed.
Velen leaned forward, her ancient eyes searching Kyle's face. "You fought beyond your limits for people you don't know, in a war you don't understand, for an Imperium that has treated you with nothing but suspicion. Why? Because they needed someone to fight for them, and I was there and I could." Kyle met the old Psyker's gaze without flinching. "In my world, we're taught that power exists to serve balance and protect those who cannot protect themselves. Watching children die because I was too afraid to act would have destroyed me more thoroughly than any wound. I fought because it was right, not because it was ordered or required. Does that make sense to you?"
Velen nodded slowly. "More sense than you might expect. The Imperium has rules and doctrines that exist for reasons beyond simple cruelty, but those rules can blind us to truths that fall outside their categories. You represent something we haven't seen before, power divorced from the warp, yet clearly not technological. The easy answer would be to declare you heretical and execute you. The harder answer is to acknowledge that our understanding has gaps and that you might fill one of them. I'm arguing for the harder answer. So is Captain Falco. So is Inquisitor Kuros, surprisingly enough." "What happens now?" Kyle tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, pain flaring through shoulder and ribs. "I assume Command wants me deployed again, given the results." "Command wants many things, not all of them compatible." Velen stood and moved to the window, looking out at the orbital platforms and the planet below. "The Tyranid threat to Pelagos Reach has been reduced, but not eliminated. Additional hive tyrants are approaching the system. The Lord General believes that your demonstration proves elemental manipulation can be weaponized against Xenos threats on strategic scales. He wants you trained, supported, and deployed in coordinated operations. But that decision falls to the Inquisition, not military command." "And what does the Inquisition want?" Velen turned back, her expression unreadable. "Inquisitor Kuros wants to understand you fully before making recommendations to higher authority. She's proposing an experiment. There's an artifact recovered from a pre-Imperium archaeological site, something that predates the Emperor's unification of Terra. It demonstrates properties similar to your elemental manipulation, suggesting human cultures once possessed similar knowledge. Kuros believes comparing your techniques to the artifact's function might provide insights into whether your power represents recovered lost science or genuine anomaly. Are you willing to undergo such testing?" Kyle considered the question, weighing options that all seemed to lead toward deeper integration into Imperial systems. But what choice existed? They were stranded in this nightmare galaxy with no path home and no allies except those earned through demonstrated utility. "I'll cooperate, not because I'm compelled to, but because understanding benefits everyone. If your artifact can teach me something about my own abilities, or if my knowledge can help you understand the artifact, that's worth pursuing." Artifact testing. The artifact testing began the following week, conducted in specialized laboratories aboard Sanctum Veritas under inquisitorial oversight and Mechanicus observation. The artifact itself was unremarkable in appearance, a simple stone disc approximately 30 centimeters in diameter, with markings that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. But when Kyle approached it, the disc began to glow with light that matched the luminescence of their own tattoos. Magus Kron's sensors went wild, detecting energy patterns that had remained dormant for millennia, suddenly activating in response to Kyle's presence. The disc rose from its containment platform and hovered at chest height, rotating slowly, as if examining its first living witness in thousands of years. Kyle reached toward the disc carefully, half expecting it to attack or explode. Instead, it pulsed once, and then released a wave of information directly into their mind. Not words or images, but pure understanding transmitted through means that transcended language. The disc was a teaching tool created by a civilization that had mastered elemental manipulation through philosophy and technique rather than technology or warp sorcery. It was designed to recognize those with potential and guide them toward greater mastery through progressive lessons that built on existing knowledge. And it recognized Kyle as someone already trained, someone who carried knowledge that the disc's creators would have acknowledged as legitimate.
new mastery. The lessons flowed quickly, building on foundations that Kyle's avatar training had established. They learned techniques for sustaining manifestation longer by drawing energy from the world's natural cycles rather than personal reserves, methods for combining elements in sequences that created emergent properties beyond simple addition, ways to sense disturbances in natural balance and use that awareness to predict threats before they manifested physically. Each technique was demonstrated through the disk's projection capabilities, showing Kyle exactly how masters of ages past had performed movements and channeled energies. It was like receiving instruction from the greatest bending masters who had ever lived, compressed into hours instead of years. Inquisitor Kuros watched the entire process through observation ports, conferring with Magus Kron and Choir Mistress Velen as they witnessed power expanding beyond initial assessment. What troubled Kuros wasn't the power itself, but its implications. If pre-Imperium human civilizations had possessed elemental manipulation capability, why had it been lost? What circumstances had caused knowledge of such obvious utility to vanish from human consciousness? The most disturbing possibility was that the Emperor himself had suppressed this knowledge during unification, deciding for reasons known only to him that elemental manipulation posed threats that outweighed its benefits. If true, what Kuros was facilitating might constitute heresy on scales that warranted exterminatus. But Pelagos Reach was dying, and the Tyranid threat extended beyond this single world to entire sectors where swarm elements are multiplying faster than Imperial forces can contain them. Desperate circumstances demanded desperate measures.
Operational freedom. Kuros made her decision and voxed orders that would change everything. Asset Epsilon would be granted provisional operational freedom, allowed to move without constant restraint or guard presence. They would be assigned to Captain Falco's command on a permanent basis, functioning as a specialized asset with authority to deploy elemental techniques as tactical situations demanded. Training would continue using the recovered artifact, and most significantly, Kyle would be granted the right to refuse orders judged incompatible with their personal code, a privilege almost unprecedented in Imperial military structure. The news reached Kyle as they concluded the day's artifact session, exhausted but exhilarated by new knowledge. Inquisitor Kuros delivered it personally, her presence in the laboratory carrying weight that made even the Mechanicus adepts pause in their observations. You've proven yourself both capable and loyal through actions that speak more clearly than any oath. The Imperium is granting you operational freedom and authority befitting your demonstrated abilities. But understand that freedom comes with responsibility. You will be watched, assessed, and judged continuously. Any deviation from the standards you've established will result in immediate sanction. Do you accept these terms? I accept, and I'll prove every day that the trust you're placing in me is deserved. Kyle stood at attention, a gesture learned from observing guardsmen rather than formal instruction. What are my orders? Return to Pelagos Reach. Captain Falco is preparing offensive operations against Tyranid hive clusters that have been identified through orbital reconnaissance. Your abilities will support these operations by providing capabilities that conventional forces lack. After Pelagos Reach is secured, we'll assess broader deployment options. The return to Pelagos Reach came with much different circumstances than Kyle's first arrival. They descended in a Valkyrie gunship surrounded by elite Tempest Scions rather than Arbite's guards, treated as a strategic asset rather than a prisoner. Captain Falco met them at the landing zone personally, his face breaking into something resembling a smile when Kyle disembarked without restraints. The reunion was brief, professional acknowledgement between warriors rather than emotional display, but it meant something to both of them. Recognition that trust existed where before there had been only suspicious cooperation. The offensive operations began immediately, targeting Tyranid hive clusters that had established themselves in Pelagos Reach's northern wastes.
These weren't simple spawning grounds, but complex biological structures that served as resource processing centers and strategic coordination nodes for the swarm. Destroying them would disrupt Tyranid operations across entire continents, buying weeks or months for evacuation efforts to complete. Standard doctrine called for orbital bombardment to eliminate such targets, but bombardment carried risks of triggering spore dispersal that could seed new infestations. Ground assault offered precision, but required forces capable of penetrating Tyranid defensive formations and surviving long enough to plant demolition charges. Kyle provided a third option, elemental assault, that could destroy hive structures without triggering defensive spore release. Elemental hive assault. The technique had been taught by the artifact, a method of attacking biological systems through manipulation of their fundamental chemistry. Water could be introduced into cellular structures and then flash frozen, shattering membranes from within. Fire could be applied at temperatures that caused protein denaturation without burning hot enough to trigger spore activation. Earth could be used to collapse underground portions of hive structures, denying the Tyranids access to mineral resources they used for bioform construction. Air could be evacuated from hive chambers, causing suffocation that left organic material intact but dead. The first hive assault demonstrated these techniques against a medium-sized cluster designated Hive Sigma 7. Kyle approached with a full company of guardsmen, providing security and heavy weapons support. The hive rose from the ash wastes like a tumor, its organic architecture pulsing with bioluminescent markers that coordinated swarm activity. Guardian organisms patrolled its perimeter, Tyranid warriors and specialized defensive morphs that existed solely to protect vital hive structures. Kyle studied the target through magnoculars, analyzing its structure and identifying weak points where elemental assault would prove most effective. The attack began with earth manipulation. Kyle knelt and placed both hands against the contaminated soil. They pushed awareness downward, finding the hive's root systems that extended deep into bedrock to extract minerals. Stone flowed in response to Kyle's will, collapsing the underground chambers and severing connections that fed the hive above. The structure shuddered, bioluminescent patterns flickering as biological systems tried to compensate for suddenly severed resource flows. Tyranid warriors responded by charging toward Kyle's position, recognizing the threat even if they couldn't comprehend its nature. Heavy bolters opened fire, cutting down the leading organisms while guardsmen established defensive perimeters. Kyle stood and shifted to water manipulation, drawing moisture from the air and the ground itself. Gallons became hundreds of gallons, coalescing into a sphere that hovered above the hive's central spire. The sphere descended slowly, engulfing the spire completely before Kyle released the technique that the artifact had taught him. Molecular bonding accelerated, water freezing from within as individual molecules locked into crystalline structures that expanded with irresistible force. The spire cracked along vertical fault lines, its cellular structure destroyed by ice formation that turned every cell into a tiny grenade of frozen expansion.
The collapse was slow but inevitable, the spire folding inward as structural integrity failed progressively. Fire came next, targeting the hive's spawning chambers where new bioforms were gestated in nutrient baths. Kyle created combustion through rapid oxidation, flames that burned blue-white and generated temperatures measured in thousands of degrees. The flames flowed into the spawning chambers through cracks created by the spire's collapse, flash-cooking everything inside before heat could disperse enough to trigger defensive spore release. The smell was horrific, burning alien flesh mixed with boiling nutrient solutions that released gases toxic even to Tyranids. Guardian organisms attempted to interfere, but Kyle maintained the assault through layers of protective air barriers that deflected bioweapon fire and turned the battlefield into a kill zone where only elemental attacks could penetrate. The final element was air evacuation, creating vacuum conditions inside the hive's deepest chambers where genetic material and strategic biomatter were stored. Kyle gestured in complex patterns that pulled atmosphere from sealed spaces, their movements almost dance-like in their precision. The vacuum spread through the hive's internal structure, following passages and chambers mapped through Earth sense. Tyranid organisms inside suffocated as oxygen levels dropped past survivability thresholds. Their deaths triggered biological failsafes that attempted to seal breaches and restore atmosphere, but Kyle maintained the vacuum despite these efforts, holding the technique steady until all life signs detected through Earth sense faded to nothing. Hive's Sigma-7 died over the course of 6 hours, its biological systems failing in a cascading sequence that left only empty chitin architecture standing. Guardian organisms scattered when synapse coordination ceased, their hive-mind connections severed by the death of controlling nodes. Kyle stood in the aftermath, breathing hard but not collapsed. The artifact's training had taught them sustainable manifestation techniques that prevented the complete exhaustion of earlier engagements. Captain Falco approached with a tactical data slate showing confirmed destruction of 97% of hive biomass without triggering spore dispersal. It was the cleanest hive elimination I've seen in 5 years of fighting Tyranids. 7 more hive clusters in the northern wastes, ranging from small to one that's nearly city-sized, Falco said, displaying orbital reconnaissance images. Command wants them all eliminated within 3 weeks to coincide with final evacuation schedules. Can you sustain operations at this intensity? Kyle studied the images, calculating energy requirements and recovery times. If I rotate between techniques to avoid exhausting any single element, and if you can provide security while I rest between assaults, yes. It will be close. The city-sized cluster will require everything I've learned and probably push past safety margins, but it's achievable. Then we move on Hive Theta 3 tomorrow. Medium cluster designated priority target due to proximity to active evacuation routes. Rest tonight, eat whatever the mess can scrounge up, and prepare for 3 weeks of continuous operations. Falco clapped Kyle's shoulder, careful to avoid the healing wound. You're going to save this world, Asset. Never thought I'd say that to anyone, let alone someone who fell out of the sky a few months ago. But it's true. Either way, the Imperium would learn something valuable about this unprecedented capability. The assault began at dawn, though dawn remained invisible beneath ash clouds that had become Pelagos Reach's permanent sky. Artillery opened fire first. Earthshaker cannons hurled shells in high arcs that impacted among the hive's outer structures. The bombardment wasn't expected to cause significant damage, but it served to draw Guardian organisms away from the central structures where Kyle would focus the main assault. Tyranid warriors and prime equivalents surged toward the Imperial lines, falling into exactly the defensive pattern Falco had predicted. Heavy weapons cut them down in organized volleys, creating kill zones that forced the Tyranids to sacrifice thousands to advance meters. Final assault. Kyle moved forward with an escort of Tempestus Scions, elite soldiers who had fought alongside them enough to understand how elemental combat worked. The assault began with earth manipulation on scales Kyle had never attempted, pulling stone from deep bedrock and creating a raised causeway that extended toward the hive's heart. The causeway rose above the corrupted ground, its surface solid enough to support armored vehicles and wide enough for infantry columns to advance in formation. Tyranid bioweapons targeted the causeway immediately, attempting to destroy it through concentrated acid spray and living ammunition. Kyle countered by making the stone flow continuously, damaged sections reforming faster than the Tyranids could destroy. The causeway became a highway to the hive's center, allowing Imperial forces to advance through what should have been impenetrable defensive formations. But maintaining it required constant focus, leaving Kyle vulnerable to direct assault. The Scions formed close protection, their hotshot lasguns and plasma weapons creating a defensive perimeter that nothing penetrated. When a Tyranid prime broke through the outer cordon and charged directly at Kyle, the Scions cut it down with concentrated fire that reduced the creature to smoking biomass before it closed half the distance. Trust existed here, forged through combat and proven through survival.
Kyle could focus on elemental manipulation because they knew the Scions would protect them. The Scions fought with absolute commitment because they knew Kyle's success meant their survival. The causeway reached the hive's outer wall.
solid chitin 3 meters thick and reinforced by biomineral structures. Kyle didn't try to break through it. Instead, they placed both hands against the wall and pushed awareness through it, mapping internal structure through earth sense that extended beyond physical touch. The hive's interior was a labyrinth of chambers and passages, all pulsing with the coordinated activity of swarm intelligence. Somewhere deep inside was the hive's heart, the control center where synapse organisms coordinated defensive operations. That was the target. Everything else was just obstacles. Water was drawn from deep aquifers, more than Kyle had ever manipulated at once. The volume was staggering, thousands of gallons rising through the earth in response to desperate need. Kyle shaped it into a drill, a rotating column of water compressed to pressures that could cut through ceramite. The drill struck the wall and bored inward, punching through the outer barrier and flooding into the hive's internal passages. Tyrannid organisms caught in the water's path were swept away or crushed by hydraulic pressure. The flood continued until entire sections of the hive were submerged, drowning chambers and passages in volumes that overwhelmed biological drainage systems. Then Kyle froze it, all of it, simultaneously. The technique pushed past every safety margin the artifact training had established, drawing on reserves that shouldn't exist and forcing molecular bonds to form across cubic meters of water in synchronized transformation. The flash freezing created ice structures that expanded with geological force, shattering the hive from within as every water-filled chamber became a shaped charge of frozen expansion. Chitin walls cracked, support structures failed, biomineral reinforcements shattered. The hive began to collapse inward, its structural architecture unable to withstand structural loads it had never been designed to bear. Kyle felt something break inside them. Some internal limit exceeded as payment for power on this scale. Blood ran from their nose and ears, the physical cost of forcing reality to comply with will beyond normal human capacity. But the assault wasn't finished. Fire came next, flowing into the cracks created by ice expansion and burning with temperatures that turned chitin to ash. Air was evacuated from sealed chambers where genetic archives were stored, creating a vacuum that collapsed internal structures. Earth rose from below, swallowing the hive's deepest foundations and cutting it off from mineral resources. All four elements worked in devastating harmony, turning the hive from living fortress to dead monument. Victory and aftermath. Across 30 minutes of sustained manifestation, the guardian organisms felt their hive die and went berserk, charging imperial lines with suicidal fury that overwhelmed defensive formations through sheer desperation. Falco ordered a fighting withdrawal, his forces pulling back along the causeway while maintaining fire discipline. Kyle collapsed, their manifestation ending as consciousness fled. The scions grabbed them immediately, one soldier hoisting Kyle over his shoulder while the others maintained covering fire during the retreat. The causeway began to deteriorate now that active maintenance had ceased, stone flowing back to its natural position and leaving only churned earth behind. But it had served its purpose, allowing the assault force to reach and destroy the target before withdrawing to safety. Hive Omega-1 burned for 3 days, its biomass consumed by fires that wouldn't extinguish until everything combustible had been reduced to ash. Tyrannid swarm coordination across the eastern hemisphere degraded to nothing. Individual organisms wandered without purpose as synaptic connections failed. The evacuation completed ahead of schedule with 0 civilian casualties during the final transports. Pelagos Reach was declared tactically secured, though ecological recovery would require centuries, if it was possible at all. Captain Falco received commendations and promotion to Major, recognition for leadership that had achieved objectives thought impossible, and Asset Epsilon was granted something unprecedented in Imperial service: rest without restraint or observation. Kyle woke in a proper bed aboard Sanctum Veritas, the medical bay's sterile walls a welcome change from field hospitals and combat zones. Inquisitor Kuros sat in her familiar chair, though this time her expression held something that might have been respect. "You accomplished strategic objectives that would have required a starship intervention or prolonged siege operations.
The Lord General is requesting your permanent attachment to Sector Command against Tyranid threats across multiple systems. The Mechanicus wants to study you until they understand every mechanism behind elemental manipulation. The Ecclesiarchy is debating whether to declare you a living saint or a dangerous heretic. You've become famous throughout the sector, Asset Epsilon. How does that make you feel?" Kyle laughed weakly, the sound rough with residual damage from the final assault. "Exhausted, confused, grateful to be alive. I came to this galaxy by accident and found myself in wars I don't understand, fighting for people I barely know, using powers that terrify those I'm trying to help. But I've also found purpose. Maybe not the purpose I would have chosen, but purpose nonetheless. So I guess I feel like I'm exactly where I need to be, even if I don't fully understand why. The Emperor works in mysterious ways, or so the Ecclesiarchy teaches. Perhaps your arrival was no accident, but divine providence. Perhaps you represent a capability that humanity possessed once and will possess again. Or perhaps you are simply an anomaly, unique and unprecedented, valuable precisely because you cannot be replicated or explained." Kuro stood and moved to the window, looking down at Pelagos Reach's scarred surface.